In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the knock sensors. Both of them, they go into one harness on this Ford Explorer. We're working on the 3.5 liter naturally aspirated engine. Let's get started. The first thing you want to do for this job is actually drain the coolant, and you'll do that through the petcock, which is located right here. Go ahead and loosen it up, and with a collection bucket underneath, let all the coolant drain until it stops. Once it's done, tighten up the petcock again so you can make sure it doesn't keep leaking. If you have an engine cover, go ahead and remove it. Ours is missing, so we're going to move on to removing the intake. First, grab this hose. This goes to the coolant overflow, and just pull it aside like this. Then we have this vacuum line right here. Pull it out of the retainers over here, but be very careful because it's plastic, it's not rubber, so you don't want to snap it and break it. You'll have to replace it if you do. There we go. Now this is released from here. Now let's unplug some connectors over here. Start with this one, set it aside, and you have this line here. On the back side, right here, you have these tabs. You want to pinch them in, just like this. As you pinch it, you want to push it out like that. There you go. Set this aside also, but again, this is the plastic line, so don't go too far because it will break. Let's unplug the throttle body connection here. Sometimes you'll need a little prying device to help you pry the red lock. Press on the connector and slide it off. Now release the clamp that holds this intake tubing onto the throttle body. Make sure it moves. If you can't pull it off, probably needs to be unthreaded a little more. Okay, leave it just like this. Follow the intake further, and you'll see that this hose for the PCV is connected to it, or this line. Move this clip back and forward, kind of like this. It should hold it in the unlocked position, so you can pull this off and just set it aside for now. Right over here, there's another clamp, 8mm socket also. Just loosen it up a little bit, unthread the bolt, and this should allow you to pull this assembly out of the way here. Okay, just like that. Looks like we have a hose attached over here. So I'm going to unplug it from here. This should be able to slide up now. Set this aside. Unclamp this hose. Use some pliers and twist the hose clamp this way so I can grab it. But once you get the hose clamp released, you should be able to pull the hose off. Sometimes these are a little tight, so just there we go. If you squeeze it enough, this one actually has a lock on it, so you can lock it in the open position and just leave it like that until you're ready to reinstall. A lot of times these rubber hoses will get stuck on here, so use something to very gently pry it, give it a couple twists, and it should break free and pop off here. There we go. Set that aside over here. Make sure the clamp doesn't fall off. Now we're ready to pull the intake off, and we just have to unbolt it at this point. There is one more hose connected to the backside, but we can't get to it until we pull it off a little bit. So there is a sequence to removing this intake. You start at this bolt right here, which is in the center, in the front, but towards the driver's side. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you jump over to the driver's side, skip over this one, 5, 6, and then go back to this one for 7. I'm going to break them free first using an 8mm socket, and then once they're broken free in this sequence, I'm going to pull them off completely. Okay, now let's remove the bolts completely. It's important to follow the sequence so that you don't potentially damage the intake. You don't want to crack it by accident. Okay, these don't come out, they stay in the intake. So right down here, between the throttle body and the intake, you'll see another 8mm bolt. You can actually easily reach it underneath the throttle body and break it free. we'll have to remove this one. This is the last thing holding the intake on. Okay, that's broken free. Okay, try not to drop the bolt. At this point, the intake should be unbolted and ready to pull up and out. If you have a lot of debris here, I know I have some leaves here, but they're not here, they're underneath, so I'm not going to worry about them yet. If you do have a lot of debris, like I said, just blow it off or vacuum it at this point. We can pull the intake up, and you're going to have to get this wiring out of the way here. Looks like it's clipped onto the intake. Pry the retainer out. Slide the intake back a little bit, and that's only so you can clear these hoses, lines, and wires, and then slide it up and forward, but don't go too far because we still have this hose at the back here. And to disconnect that easily, just grab some pliers, pinch the hose clamp, squeeze it, slide it off, and then move the hose off of here. You can use pliers or a little prying tool to help you slide it off. Set this aside. Now let's unbolt this bracket that is bolted onto the head here that holds the fuel rail. 8mm socket, remove the bolt completely. Set this aside safely. Now let's unplug the fuel injectors. These right here, right underneath the fuel rail. There's a locking clip on them. Sometimes they're a little hard to get. If you can't get them by hand because they're stuck, which a lot of times they are, you could just use some pliers and very gently pinch it and grab it, slide it up and out. Usually the pliers give you a little more leverage on the locking retainer there. But be very gentle. If you use pliers, you don't want to break the connectors. Now do the same on the back side here. There should be 3 on the front and 3 on the back. Okay, with those set aside, we can unbolt the 4 8mm bolts that hold these fuel rails onto the engine. Okay, be very careful not to drop anything down here. If you wanted to, you could put some rags down here and just cover up the intake port holes. Don't stuff the rag all the way down, but this will prevent debris from getting in there as we pull up the fuel rail. Okay. Now we can lift the fuel rail up. Keep in mind the fuel rails might be kind of stuck here because of the O-rings on the injectors. There's nothing else holding this on, but even though it moves, it might not pop out. Try to avoid prying it. Prying it could either damage whatever you're prying on or could break the injector. So if possible, don't use a pry bar or a screwdriver or anything like that. Just kind of wiggle it back and forth and put some upwards pressure on it by hand in order to break this free. It should eventually pop out. Okay. Once you work it enough, you'll get one out. Therefore, the next one will want to pop up. We just have one left on this side. You can sometimes spray a little bit of brake parts cleaner down there. This will help lubricate the O-rings, and I know what you're thinking. Brake parts cleaner dries stuff out. But in this case, it actually will help the O-rings And this is also what we're going to use to reinstall when the time comes. Okay. There we go. That one popped out as well. Perfect. So now we just have to do this one in the rear here. Try to give these a couple twists, wiggle them back and forth. This part of the rail is done. And hopefully this gives us more wiggle room for the rear. I'll spray these as well. Oh, this one popped out. Perfect. One more. Yeah, all right. The O-ring on that one stayed in there, but that's okay. We have new O-rings anyway. Now we just have to pull this up and out, set it aside. Can't go too far with it because this is a hard line, but there is a hose right by that bracket that we unbolted. So at this point, we can just do this with it and set it to the side. Two 8mm bolts hold this thermostat housing in place onto the lower intake. I'm not going to remove any of these hoses because we're not removing the thermostat housing. I just want to pull it away and separate it from the intake. So get your 8mm socket on here, break these free. With this one broken free, I'm going to switch to this one. That way I loosen them evenly. Because there are only two, I don't want to put pressure sideways on this housing or on the lower intake. I want them loosened up evenly. All right, I have a collection bucket underneath just in case some more coolant drips out. It might or it might not. That's one, and two down here. They're both the same. You don't have to worry about mixing them up or putting them back in the same threaded area that they came from. Set those aside, and you can pull this back. There we go. That's all we needed, just a little bit of separation. Now let's remove the lower intake. Same as for the upper, I'm going to break the bolts free first in the proper sequence. That's basically going from the center out, starting on one side and then crossing over, and then I'll remove them all the way. Okay, that's all of them. Now let's remove them completely. Before we completely pull the lower intake out, if you have any debris along where it meets the engine, just remove it, and you definitely want to make sure it doesn't get inside the cylinders. Having said that, let's pull this up, break it free. The gaskets are probably going to be somewhat stuck on there, so just wiggle it back and forth. Okay, there we go. Apply some pressure, and you should be able to slide it right up and out. Now let's remove this hose that goes onto the crossover tube. We'll have to pull the tube out, and that requires disconnecting one of these two connections here. You can either pinch the white clip and pull the whole fitting off, or disconnect the hose off of the fitting. you choose whatever you want to do, but I will take the hose off of the fitting because a lot of times these fittings break and I don't want to disturb this connection here, which is going to be weaker, the seal especially, than the hose with the clamp. Having said that, I'm going to get my hose clamp pliers on the clamp so I can squeeze it. As you can see, the hose is already moving. Try to get the clamp down. And then I can just let go of the clamp over here and just grab the hose and pull it right off. Now the coolant temp sensor here is actually wrapped around this crossover pipe and I want to get it out of my way, so I'm going to unplug it, move it up and over this way, and I'm just going to leave it over here, plug it back in. It doesn't need to be wrapped around that way, but I did have to get it out of my way. Okay, make sure that clicks. Now pull back on this crossover tube. Coolant will come out in the center there. Okay, pull it back, push it up a little bit. We have to also disconnect it from the thermostat housing here. And it looks like this coolant temp sensor is in my way, in fact, so I'm going to unplug it from down here. Okay, get this connector out of the way. Now we can hopefully lift this up like that. Pull it out of the thermostat housing. It's just held in with an O-ring, but a lot of times these O-rings will get stuck. So it'll be difficult to separate it. It is moving. I just have to put a little bit more sideways force into it. There we go. That's out. This is the harness for your knock sensors, which I will unplug at this point so that once they're unbolted, we can just remove them. Press on the little locking tab up here. Pull the connector down and off. Okay, there's the connector. Now you can see your knock sensors right here. There's two, one here and one here. Use a 10mm socket and break them free. Remove the bolt all the way. All right, so here's this one. Take the bolt out, make sure you don't drop it, and leave this here because we have to unbolt the other one in order to remove them. They're both on the same harness. So take the 10mm and break this one free. Finish removing this bolt. Okay. Get this bolt out as well. And now grab the knock sensor harness, remove the knock sensors. Here are the knock sensors. Next, I want to blow out these holes because as you can see, there's coolant here, which I will take care of after the knock sensors are in. But I don't want any liquid inside the threaded holes of the knock sensors. The reason for that is because these are closed holes. They don't have any sort of exit or passageway on the other side. And if there is liquid, such as coolant, in there, and I tried to thread the bolt down, it's probably going to hydrolock the hole. What that means is you're trying to compress a liquid that is incompressible, and it's either going to rip the threads out or crack the block. As you can see, a little bit of moisture came out. Same with that one. I want all of that out of there. Okay. Also, make sure the surface is clean. I have no corrosion whatsoever here and here. It's perfect. I'm going to wipe it with a little rag just to make sure that it's really clean. But you want a good contact for the knock sensor because the knock sensors take their reading through the vibrations that get transferred on this machine surface. So if it's not perfect, it's not going to read properly. It's very important. Now, get the new knock sensors, put the harness down into place. Try not to drop these. Any sort of shocks can potentially damage them. Line them up approximately with where they go, and then take the bolts and slide them down. If the bolts are in poor condition due to corrosion or anything else, replace them or clean them up if you can clean them up and reuse them. Put this down. I'm going to start these by hand, bottom them out, and then I'll torque them. It's very important to torque these for the same reason. If these are over tightened, they will be too sensitive and they'll read when they are not supposed to. And if they are under tightened, not only could the bolt back out by itself from vibrations, but it could also take a false reading or not take a reading at all when there's a problem. So you want to make sure these are tightened properly. Also, I'm not going to use any sort of impacting tools to tighten these down. I don't want to send any unnecessary shocks through the sensors. And now that these are bottomed out, let's torque them. The torque for these is 177 inch-pounds. That converts to 14.75 foot-pounds, so basically 15. That's 1. And 2. Now let's reconnect the knock sensors. The connector has to click. Mine did. It was very quiet, but I felt it. So make sure it's locked in. If you have coolant down there, which you most likely do, you want to make sure you absorb it up with something or vacuum it if you have a vacuum that can suck up liquid. Just make sure you don't use a dry vacuum for this. But either way, you want to get it out of here. You don't want to leave it here because two things. One, it's liquid that sits here. It can cause some damage over time. But also, as the engine gets hot, you're actually going to smell this as it evaporates. And you don't want to confuse the smell of this with a coolant leak if you actually have one. But also, it's not good to breathe this in. So you want to make sure you get it all out of here. I'm using some absorbent pads. It's not going to be perfect. I just want the majority of this coolant out of here. Now it's time to reinstall this crossover pipe for the coolant. You don't have to install new O-rings if yours are in good condition. So just inspect them, make sure they're not torn or brittle or damaged or squished down. If that's the case, replace them or you'll have a coolant leak. Now grab the crossover tube and let's put it back into the thermostat housing down here. Line it up, check your O-ring, make sure it's seated properly, which it is. And it should be actually coated with coolant, so that will help it slide in a lot easier. Make sure it's bottomed out completely. Move it around. There we go, perfect right there. That's seated all the way. Now line up the crossover tube over there. Make sure that area is clean. I already double checked it. Slide it in. If the O-ring is lubricated with coolant, that's actually perfect because it'll just fall right into place. Now let's plug in the coolant temp sensor. Make sure the connector clicks. There we go. Set the wire down here out of the way of the intake. Let's get this hose back on. Make sure it's bottomed out all the way. Grab the clamp, slide it back on. Usually I like to put the clamps right back in their same position that they came from, but in this case, because it's all the way underneath, I'm actually going to set it to the side right here. That way it's a lot easier to access next time. Now let's clean up this area where the lower intake will mount. Sometimes you'll have built up corrosion here, and you want to use a razor blade to clean it. You can use a sanding block if you want, but you have to be very careful. First of all, make sure it's perfectly flat. Second of all, use very fine grit sandpaper, 400 grit or higher. Don't use anything coarse because it'll create grooves in this material and then it won't seal up. I prefer to use a razor blade because it's flat and it's gentle. So just scrape off all this corrosion here. Try not to get it inside the portholes. My area is actually somewhat clean. I don't have a lot of debris to scrape off, but just go around, do all 6 of the runners, and then we'll put the intake on. Also get around here. These are coolant ports on both sides. Obviously, once again, make sure you don't scrape stuff inside. If a little bit falls in, that's fine. Use some compressed air, blow it out, or use a vacuum and suck it up, but it's not the end of the world. On the lower intake, this right here is where the thermostat housing bolts up with that gasket, so make sure this isn't rusted. I know I have a little bit of rust here, but actually the seal goes right on this black part that's painted, so I'm good to go. If you do have a lot of rust buildup, you're probably going to need a lower intake. Having said that, let's slide this in, pull the fuel rail with the injectors up and out of the way as much as you can. As you slide this down, try not to catch any of those gaskets and tear them or make them fall out of place. And be as gentle as possible so you don't damage the injectors either. Okay, slide this down into place and just try to line up the bolt holes the best you can. Looks like everything lines up for me, so that's great. So now let's put the bolts in for the intake to make sure everything is centered up. Let's start in all of the bolts by hand. Doesn't matter what sequence you use for putting them in, it just matters how you tighten them. So I'm just gonna go around, start on one end. The more bolts you line up and put in, the more likely it is for the rest of them to line up. Make sure you're not cross-threading any of these. All right, they're all started. Now I'm going to snug them up in the correct sequence, which I'll mention in a second. And then after I snug them, I will then go around again and torque them to the proper torque spec. Now let's snug up the intake bolts. You want to go in the same sequence that we did to loosen them up. So start in the middle, go across, and just work your way towards the outer ones. I'm not torquing them yet. The torque will come after they're snug. I just want to bottom them out and hold the intake nice and tight. As you can see, it still has some play at this point, and we want to eliminate that. Try and hold it as centered as possible. Now torque it to 89 inch-pounds, and that converts to 7.4 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench that actually goes that low, just make them nice and snug with a short ratchet. All right, now I'm going to go over one more time, because a lot of times with rubber gaskets like this, as you tighten the last few, the first few that you tightened actually get loose because the rubber squishes and creates more slack. So it's always a good idea to double check them. You don't necessarily have to go in the same sequence this time, but you can if you want to. As you can see, this one needed a little bit more to be fully tightened to the spec provided. All the other ones seem good, but I'm still going to double check them. There we go. Let's reconnect the thermostat housing. Put the two bolts in. There we go. Bottom these out and then torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Okay, 89 inch-pounds. That's torqued. Now let's put the fuel rail on, line it up. As you slide it down, make sure that all the holes for the fuel injectors are clean. There's no debris in there. Okay, that's lined up. To slide them all in, I'm going to spray brake parts cleaner on all of them. And now, there we go. Nice light push. Should get them all seated perfectly. Let's get the bolts in. Starting by hand. Try to hold these pretty much centered and snug these up. Make sure these are nice and snug. Give them about a quarter turn after they bottom out. Perfect. Let's secure the line. Make sure it's twisted the right way. There we go. Let's reconnect the fuel injectors. Make sure they click. You don't want these coming off of here by themselves as the vehicle is running. Can't see anything here. Now let's get the upper intake on. Make sure all the gaskets are still in position. Mine are. Before we completely put it on, we need to reattach this hose at the back here. It'll be a lot easier to do it now rather than after this is already in. So make sure it's bottomed out completely. Just like that. Now let's grab some pliers, get that clamp on. Position it right about where it was before. Now we can line up the rest of the intake with the lower intake. Make sure you don't pinch any wires or hoses in here. Get these out of the way. There we go. That lines up perfectly right there. Manually start in the bolts so that you can make sure that not only are they not cross-threading, but if they all start in, you know you're perfectly lined up, so you have nothing else to worry about. Okay, one more over here, and one more back here. Okay, before I attach anything else, I'm going to tighten this down so that other than that hose in the back, nothing is putting pressure on it. Not that the hoses or the wires would put pressure on it, but I just want it to seat perfectly, and I want to know that it's installed fully. I'm going to snug these down with my 8mm socket, and then the sequence for this is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then cross over 5, 6, and then back to the middle, number 7. Remember, there is one more bolt that goes underneath the throttle body all the way in the back on that bracket, but we'll worry about that later. That one is not part of the sequence. Just make them snug. I'm not torquing them yet. Double check the first few. Okay, now let's torque them to 89 inch-pounds in the same sequence, and then we'll do an additional 45 degrees after the 89 inch-pounds. 89 inch-pounds is about 7.4 foot-pounds. That's 89 inch-pounds for all of them, but I will go over it again because as with all rubber gaskets, the first few might loosen up as you tighten the last few. And because we have degrees involved to finish torquing them, you want to make sure that your base torque, which is a foot-pound number, is correct. If your initial torque or the base torque is not right, once you do the degrees, the ones that are not properly tightened will be off to a different final torque. I have a torque wrench that reads degrees, so I have it set to 45 degrees, but if you don't have this, you can just use a ratchet or a little breaker bar and go 1/8 of a turn. You can either mark the bolt or just visually look at it as you're turning. That's it right there. Same sequence. At this point, they're all torqued. You don't want to touch the bolts anymore. If you doubt yourself, you're going to have to loosen them up and start all over again. If you continue tightening or even loosening at this point, you completely ruin the procedure that we just did. And the final torque will be out of spec. Underneath the throttle body, if you follow it, it's very difficult to see, but there's going to be that bracket that had a bolt going through it. We removed it with an extension, slide that bolt in, get this started, bottomed out, and tightened down. Okay, that's nice and snug. Let's reconnect all the connectors and hoses around the throttle body here. Connect the throttle body itself. Make sure that clicks. You didn't hear it, I didn't hear it, but I felt it. Lock the connector in. Now let's put this hose back on this valve here, lock it down, and connect the electrical connector for it. Make sure that clicks. Next we had a vacuum hose over here. Slide that over, bottom it out all the way. Let's get this clamp back on here, lock that hose on. This was just pointed down over here. This coolant hose that goes across was secured on these plastic retainers, and then this vacuum line, actually it's just a plastic line, secures itself onto the retainers on the fuel rail. Let's put the air intake duct back. Slide it over the air filter housing, and make sure that on the bottom this lip doesn't roll over. You want it to seat on the housing, just like this. There we go, press it on all the way. Now, on this side, put it over the throttle body. Once again, make sure it seats. All the way around, just like this. Give it a couple spins to ensure. This hose goes back on here. This one back on here. Make sure this clicks. Now with this situated properly, let's tighten up the two hose clamps. 8mm socket. One over here. Don't make them very tight, just snug. These strip out easily, and once they do, you have to replace it with a new one. Just like that. Perfect. Now if you had an engine cover, you'd put it back on. It goes onto these grommets here, but ours is missing, so we don't have anything to put back on. Now let's fill the cooling system. You can see the maximum and minimum lines on the reservoir are here and here. You want it to be between these two once you're done. However, we do have to bleed it. So I'm going to go to right above the maximum line. Then once we bleed it, most likely the air is going to make up for that difference. It'll suck the coolant in, bleed the air out, and then the level should hopefully be right in between these two. If it's too low, obviously add some. If it's too high, you're going to want to drain some either through the radiator, or you can suck some out through here if you have a turkey baster that you use for removing fluids, or a fluid extraction pump. Check your owner's manual. If you're not sure what kind of coolant to use, make sure you use the manufacturer's recommended type. I filled it up to here, which is slightly above the maximum, like I said, but I'm going to run the vehicle and the air will get pushed out, the fluid will get drawn in. So let's do that. Now that we've ran the vehicle, the coolant is pretty much right at the maximum line. So double check yours, like I said, add if necessary. Cap this off and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.